Before I discuss what makes a counter-narrative and why they matter, I must provide the definition of a counter-narrative. Counter-narratives are stories that offer a challenge to or raise questions about the dominant narrative. Dominant narratives are the stories that we hear over and over again. To further explain this point, here's an example of each. One dominant film narrative that we watch for this class is Freedom Writers. Freedom Writers is a dominant narrative because the plotline and story that it tells is a commonly heard one in Hollywood. White savior narratives that take place in schools tell us stories about white teachers civilizing corrupt urban school students that everyone else has given up on. This same narrative can be seen in films like Dangerous Minds and The Principal. One counter-narrative film that we watch for class, which is also within the urban school genre, is Walkout. Walkout is considered a counter-narrative because it challenges the dominant ideologies held about urban schools, which are portrayed in Hollywood blockbuster films. One way that the film does this is by portraying the students as the ones bringing the change within their schools, while dominant narrative films within the urban school genre include a white savior who fixes the school instead. Another big difference between dominant and counter narrative films is who is behind the camera. The producers of dominant narrative films are often people with a lot of power, wealth, and prestige, while the producers for counter narratives often do not have all of these things. After taking this into consideration, now one must think, what racial groups have the most power, prestige, and wealth in America? This happens to be white people. Now, when applying this to dominant narrative and counter narrative films, one can come to the conclusion that the majority of people producing dominant narrative films are white, and the majority of people producing counter narrative films are minorities. Now, it is vital to think about the types of stories that these people are producing. There are no victims in this classroom. Don't use me as another excuse as to why you can't succeed. These two quotes are featured in dominant narrative films within the urban school genre. These quotes completely undermine the effects of institutional or systemic racism. These quotes imply that nothing is holding these students back but themselves, when in reality, they are oppressed by the very institutions that they live under. As I stated earlier, dominant narratives are accepted as legitimate. Therefore, quotes like these teach Americans the wrong message, being that urban students just need to get their acts together and then they can succeed. No inclusion of the effects of systemic racism are included in dominant narratives. And for this very reason, counter narratives are so important. Since society accepts these dominant narratives as legitimate, counter narratives are so important because they debunk the falsities that can often be portrayed in dominant narrative films by providing another perspective. Counter narratives have the power to change how we view society for the better. When counter narrative films like Walkout acknowledge things like the three levels of discrimination, audiences take in those messages and are now therefore more aware of racism in America and the effects of it. Now, here's where meritocracy comes into play. The whole myth of meritocracy is based around ideas conveyed in dominant narrative films. In the case of the urban school genre, films teach us that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, but urban students just need to be put into place. The three levels of discrimination show us that this is not the case and that meritocracy is therefore a myth. And if society as a whole keeps believing in meritocracy, we are not going to get very far in the conversation of racial equality. So, to conclude, counter narratives matter because they have the power to provide a more accurate image of society. The perspectives of minorities are not typically given justice in dominant narrative films, so counter narratives are important because they are based on a larger frame by showing what else there is to stories aside from what we see over and over again in dominant narratives. I urge you to be critical of all the media that you consume, as it can save you from limiting your own personal frame of view.